Good afternoon in New York and good evening
Good
in
afternoon.
Holland, and welcome to Artist Talk on Art on Monday, May 11th, 2026. I'm Doug Shear, president of ATOA. ATOA is the world's longest running forum and one of its most prolific, having held and recorded over 1,200 copyrighted events since 1974, featuring over 9,000 artists and other arts professionals. Recordings are then posted to our YouTube channel and ultimately added to our collection at the Smithsonian Institution's Archives of American Art, where our holdings of audio and video files are the largest from the visual arts. Please hold your questions or comments until the end of what we expect to be about a 90-minute dialogue. And now something about today's presenters. Wanda Tuerlinckx is a visual artist and works in Amsterdam. Her work is included in the collections of the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam and the Amsterdam City Archives, among a number of others. In collaboration with human-machine interaction, scientist Dr. Erwin Boer, she has been working since 2016 on the Robot Portraits series, which combines features of art photography with the scientific photographic narrative first introduced in 1841 by William Fox Talbot, who in his own time reported on technical and scientific revolution. Continuing this objective process of scientific registration, Wanda Tuerlinckx records the stages and realizations of robots through the reflexive eye of a 19th century camera, from a time when technological possibilities began to materialize in the world we live in today. Dr. Erwin R. Boer has carved out a niche for himself in the cross-disciplinary interaction between humans and machines. His research focus has been twofold. On one hand, he focuses on developing mathematical models of how
What?
humans interact with machines to design better interfaces and more intuitive
Oh,
machines that humans collaborate with rather than use as a
yeah.
tool. On the other hand, he pursues anything that fuels the intellectual satisfaction he gains from developing algorithms to solve all kinds of problems across disciplines, including the dynamics and lifetime of mesoscale convective clouds, the trap and siphon properties of graphs, and the human factors of car crashes. He is known for his behavioral entropy theory, which states that the entropy of human behavior is a direct reflection of how well she understands her environment or her task, as well as how much attention she pays. And now I'm happy to turn things over to our two presenters.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much. It's a great honor to be present here and to be able to talk about the intersection between science and photography and robotics. And I think particularly the topic of robotics is very actual in current day society. And Wanda has already started this project many, many years ago, even before I joined it. And maybe you can tell us a little bit how you got to design or pick a project that you use a camera from the 1880s to photograph today's robots.
Yes, the camera was the beginning of everything because I found this very old camera in a little village in the Netherlands. It was in a photo camera museum where these beautiful old cameras were standing, and I was really totally in love with it. And so I drove the next day back to this little village because it was closed at the time that I was there. And I found this beautiful camera, a 19th century camera. It's a little bit like a camera obscura. So it is very kind of actually a wooden box with a lens, and I was very kind of I was charmed by its simplicity. So with this camera, I was in the beginning making portraits of kind of people in their 20s, kind of dresses and so on. And then I was thinking about how can I do something which is unfamiliar with this kind of camera. So I was looking to subjects, futuristic subjects like very modern architecture. But then there was this in the newspaper, there was this subject about story about robots. And that was, I'm talking, it was 2012 when I found the camera, and I started with the subject robotics around 2015. Yeah, for me it was like, yes, this is it, you know, this old eye looking at the future, you know. It was, for me, it was like a very nice concept to start with, especially because this idea of these two revolutions, you know, when the camera photography started, the first industrial revolution, and robotics is actually this fourth industrial revolution. So I was thinking, wow, this is a beautiful kind of time collapse that can happen, you know, when this old eye is photographing the future. So that's actually the start of this kind of new kind of project. So I first went to universities in the Netherlands where I could photograph kind of robot systems, like you know, very abstract kind of forms. And there I met Erwin, because he was there working with his human machine subject. And yeah, and that's actually because Erwin saw the camera and he was very curious about what I was doing there, you know, with this old camera and this kind of contradiction with the robots. So that was actually the start of an interesting collaboration in terms of science and art. So that was actually the beginning of this new direction.
Yeah, so when I saw Wanda, I was working at the Technical University of Delft, where a lot of robots had been developed to understand the mechanisms of movements, especially in humans. There's a beautiful example, and I can show one of the robots. This is a walker. This is a walking robot, and if you think about human movements, it's very efficient, and it really all starts with trying to construct the elements of a robot. So we looked at human walking, human expression, human control. How does a robot walk through the environment? How does the robot move through the environment? How can the robot reach something? But one of the interesting things was, and that also came about when Asimo, the Honda robot, came around. We also have a photograph of that. So the Asimo robot we photographed in Japan at the Honda Aoyama building. And that robot, while it looks like a human, it's called a humanoid robot. So it has a human form and human shape, has human abilities, but doesn't have human facial expressions, doesn't have a human face, and it also doesn't have the cognition and verbal abilities that a human has. But the interesting thing about this robot is that it is much heavier than a human, and it also uses about 10 times as much energy to walk than a human. So if you want to build robots that can move through and work with people in society, it has to be efficient, it has to be agile. And this is not an agile robot, but it was really the beginning of understanding, how efficient humans are. And one of the things that roboticists often look at is trying to understand humans better. And as a mathematician and a modeler, when you develop a computational model of a process or something that walks or something that moves like a human, you understand a tremendous amount because you can see it fail, you can see how efficient it is, you see what it's capable of, you can see how complex the machinery is, and then you can try to build something that is akin to a human. So to me, robotics, in the end, should be collaborative. And what is more collaborative and making collaboration more possible is when you actually can share emotions. And we will get back to that point of what it means to be emotive, to have empathy and things like that. But I think we should first focus on what the old camera accomplished and how the old camera looked at robots, simply because of its technology. And maybe you can say a little bit about why you feel that this robot comes to life or feels like it might actually have human qualities, and maybe even question whether it's a robot or a human.
Yes, the one of the ideas with this old eye looking at the future was in a way how this camera was used for in the past, was made possible that it could make portraits of people, where actually the idea was to have this kind of soulfulness, within a portrait that would come out. So it has to do with because in the beginning, to make a portrait, it was quite difficult, with this kind of cameras, because people really had to sit still, it was kind of sometimes they were a little bit moved, because it was not, people could not sit still for 6 seconds, because you need to sit still with this technique for 6 seconds. So actually, the soft focus of the lens made it possible to get the idea that there was a level, of soulfulness that came out through the portrait of the robot. Because the difference with, for example, to make a picture of the robot with modern camera, you see every detail, it is like every detail you see, and now with this soft focus, it disappears a little bit, and and sometimes you get this kind of, is this with this technique that you have the idea that something is alive within the portrait, of the robot. Something is coming out. And the example of Android U, there was this art critic in the Netherlands who made an article about this picture, because this human gaze that came out is very kind of, in a way, surreal, that in a machine that is in fact not alive, there is something that's coming alive within this photograph of within this portrait, and that is a little bit, the idea of this camera, that it can make a portrait of a robot come alive in a way.
Yeah, so I think it might be useful. I'm sure some of you might have questions about these different types of robots. So the early robots are, as Wanda has also mentioned, basically representations or part human models of movements, reaching, eye gaze, eye movement, cameras in the eyes, microphones in the ears, some computation. to basically start building the components that you need for a robot. And if you go a little bit further, you get into robots such as humanoids. And here is a beautiful example of a humanoid robot. So this is really just a collection of motors and wires and mechanisms that were possible because of the miniaturization of these types of mechanisms and also special materials that happened in the second industrial revolution. So this is a robot that doesn't look like a human facially, but has the abilities to express itself like a human. And in this case, it is capable of playing music. And a lot of these types of early robots were developed in Japan. Later on, we already saw that one. We had more sophisticated and advanced robots. We also have robots now from Boston Dynamics. We even have robots that can run half marathons, that can participate in dance contests, etc., etc. So they're all capable of performing certain human body actions, movement actions. To really interact with a human, it became recognized that some expressions are necessary. So a lot of development went into creating something that looks like a face. And this is a special type of rubber called frubber, facial rubber, that was designed by David Hansen. And I think he was still in Texas at that point, but moved his operation to Hong Kong because of the availability and the close access of technology and microchips and things like that. So this is a robot where behind the face, it has all these different mechanisms, all these different motors that pull on the face, very much like the facial muscles that we have. There is I think it's a Norwegian or Swedish scientist that developed an Ekman facial coding, and we took exactly that coding with the facial muscles to create all the human facial expressions. So this robot is able to make many facial expressions. And here you see a portrait of Einstein with the motors, very miniaturized, all embedded within the skull. So it's not like there is a separate computer outside the robot that controls everything. Everything is inside the robot. And this really is also part of what we'll talk about a little bit later, embodied cognition. Then once you can have these facial expressions and you can miniaturize everything, you can get into robots that actually very much look like a human and are actually past humans. This is Suzaki, who's a Nobel laureate author who gave lessons, who took classes and lectured at this university, Nishikagusa University in Tokyo. And this robot was commissioned to be created after his liking with a suit that he wore to sit in a classroom at a desk that is from that age, reading and lecturing about his work and his novels, and speaking and facially expressing himself as if he's a human being. And that, continues, and we'll have some more that we'll talk about later, but it's essentially a whole evolution of robots where you have the initial elements that are slowly being perfected to create something that is as human as possible. And once you have a human as possible, you get to the question as to why are we making these robots? And a lot of the roboticists answer that by trying to get a handle on what makes us truly human. We're all grappling with that. Since antiquity, we've been wrestling with what makes us human. And the interesting aspect now is that as AI and robotics advances, is there a point where we can no longer distinguish a robot from a machine? And so I think it'd be useful to talk about these robots in the context of art. How do you see these robots as art or even as artists? Maybe we should focus first on, how do these robots come about as art? Are they art themselves? Mm-hmm. Are they artistic? Is the photograph artistic?
For me, roboticists are really the new sculptures, in a way, because it is actually, it is in art, it was always a kind of that people were, or that there was a reproduction of people, of humans, that was created, and before you had sculptures, and now you have robots. It is a kind of a new way of making, of creation, but also in reproductions of human beings, And I think for me, they are really like artists, because they make this kind of ideals in their own way, in a form, in a beautiful form, or in an expressive form, or whatever. So, and I think if you see, for example, at Ida as an artist, she's known as being, a very famous artist those times. And she was actually invented by Aidan Meller. He himself is also a gallerist. So it is interesting to see how many robots are, in fact, not only from the creators themselves, who are artists, like Ishiguro, who was before a painter. David Hanson, he was actually a designer, and Aidan Meller is an art gallerist. So there is much of, art involved in robotics. And Ida is actually a very good example, I think, because she made last year or the year before, she made this portrait of Alan Turing.
Right.
So and she sold it for $1 million, and at Sotheby's. So it is actually a very interesting question in how far robots themselves are artists, and what make them artists. Because when you speak about art is the most individual expression of the most individual emotion. How is this with artists? It's a very interesting question. How do they experience emotions? Are there emotions? What does it mean to be emotional? So that's an interesting question into the art scene, especially with AI now. How is this? How is this going to shift in the future? How is this idea of emotion is going to progress, actually?
Right.
What do you think, Erwin, about this?
Yeah, I find Ida absolutely fascinating. She is the first robot that created art. We can think of AI as creating art. We have generative AI. It can generate interesting pictures. It can generate poetry. ChatGPT can make many interesting things, but most of those are not considered art. But the interesting aspect here is now that Ida, who is actually modeled after Ada Lovelace, a mathematician from the early 19th century. And Ada Lovelace is considered the first programmer. She was working closely with Charles Babbage, who created a general engine. It was basically a machine that could calculate mathematical equations. It was purely focused on mathematics. And Ada Lovelace recognized that this machine might be capable of much more. It might be able to do things beyond mathematics. And that was really the beginning of a thinking that let go of maybe not everything is predictable. Maybe there is more than maybe we can create a general computer. Maybe we can create a general AI. And now we are pretty far advanced into that timeline. And the interesting twist now is, and of course, Aidan Meller, the creator of the robot, together with Oxford University scientists, and I think Brigham University, and there was also another company that helped actually build the robots. They picked Alan Turing as the person to be painted by her. And Alan Turing is really the father of computing. There's the Turing machine, which is the first self It's basically a sequence of codes that gets converted into actions or understandings or mathematical equations. So it's a general computer, very much like the one that Ada Lovelace identified. And Alan Turing is also the person who came up with the Turing test. And the Turing test is a test where, in those days, you have a typewriter, and you talk to a terminal screen, and you get text back. You know, what is the weather today? And you get an answer. What is it like to be angry at somebody? And you get an answer. You know, do you understand how far the moon is away? And you get an answer. And depending on the answers you get, if the person asking the questions can't tell if the answers come from a robot or from a human, then that system has some human qualities. It's all hidden. It's very much like ChatGPT. But then what we recognize is that you need to put it in a body. And, you know, there's an idea that, you know, to be truly human, you need to be embodied. The way we think, the way we feel is so much related to our body. So to push that understanding further, we put all the computation and all the AI into a robot that is more or less autonomous. You know, a lot of them can walk, they can talk, they carry their own energy. Of course, they will have to be charged for now. And they can create art, like Ida. So she created Alan Turing. And the interesting thing to me is, you know, is it art that she created? Is it art because, like Wanda said, you know, art is the most individualistic expression of the most individualistic emotion. Does she have that? You know, does she follow that definition of art? Or is she more along the lines of what were we talking about? You know, art as a something new, something different, something.
Yes, because that's also very interesting, how art, for example, you know, evolved, you know, in history, and how robotics evolved. There is a kind of, how do you say, a kind of two directions going in different ways. Can you say something about this?
Yeah, I think I alluded to that a little bit already. If you look at the development of art, you know, in the golden ages, it was all very realistic. It was basically a representation, almost like the way photography started, as Wanda explained, capturing realism, but also capturing human emotions. So in the past days, if you look at a person like Rembrandt, he was so able to capture an emotion of a person and the special light and the atmosphere in the room, very realistic. Everything was there. Everything what it means to be human and part of society was embodied in those paintings. And then we, you know, stepped through Impressionism, where it became more about the artists expressing how they see the world, and maybe being frustrated about the fact that they can't see they can't express themselves, just like many musicians have talked about that. You know, even the music isn't rich enough. We need different types of music. We need additional things, and there's a whole experimental movement with that, with John Cage being a beautiful example. And then you go towards more abstraction, you know, expressionism, cubism, surrealism. And now the question is, are we at the end of that? Because in the 60s and 70s, we saw art that is questionably still the expression of emotion. Andy Warhol, is that an expression of an emotion? Or is that really flipping it around, where now it is not so much the expression of the emotion of the artist, but more the expression of the emotion of the, or the elicitation of the expression of emotion by the viewer. So there's something new and different pushing against the boundaries of what is art.
Yes, and how do you see that, for example, you know, with the evolvement of robotics, is the other way around, no?
Correct. Yeah. So robotics really, you know, in antiquity, we didn't have the abilities. We didn't have rubber. We didn't have the small machines. We didn't have the flexible materials. So it very much started with clunky, abstract representations of machines and human beings. And as we showed, you know, going from individual walking robots to, pumping hearts, to movements of arms, fingers. A lot of time was spent on fingers, very much like Leonardo da Vinci really tried to get the drawing of the fingers just right, and also understanding the mechanisms in that. And that continues, but we basically went from abstract to realism. And the current robots, the interesting thing there to me is you have the mechanisms, you have the body of a robot that is capable of doing whatever it gets instructed to do. And the old robots were programmed. The new robots have embedded AI.
Yes.
So they live in the world, they perceive for themselves. They're not pre-programmed, they're just pre-programmed to learn in a general way. And at some point, the question is, and I think IDA is at the forefront of that, they might develop an internal world that they then could express and becoming an art form that we then might be able to try to interpret to understand robots. Just like some artists who felt like they were outside society tried to express themselves in art to maybe be understood by society better. Is this any different?
And how do you think that IDA fits into this idea of self-expression of emotions?
Yeah, I don't think IDA is quite there yet. To me, the art that IDA creates is something new, is something different. It can be viewed as the AI in IDA sees something, a portrait or a picture of Alan Turing, and interprets that through some sort of complex algorithm to create something new. As a computer scientist and as a roboticist, I can see that mechanism very well. I'm not saying that's the case, but at some point, we will end up with computers that have their own experience in the world, just like people. And if we give them their own way to express themselves, and they have an internal representation of the world that is perhaps similar to ours, because they have a similar body, but may also be completely different. And to me, that is an interesting stage where we might get some art that we don't expect.
What do you think, what is the difference between, for example, the portrait of IDA, of Alan Turing, with, for example, a portrait of, a famous painter like, let's say, Van Gogh, who made a portrait of, for example, Gauguin or so? I mean, what is the difference that you can recognize as in your in your view as the viewer, in your emotional experience as the viewer?
When I look at a painting of Van Gogh, and maybe this is a quirky way of thinking about it, I know it's painted by a human. I know
Why?
It's painted by a struggling human.
Because
I know.
So it's not a feeling, it's because
I think it plays a role that I know it's a human. And I think that's why the Alan Turing test is so interesting, whereas IDA, I know it's a robot, she creates a picture, and I can imagine how one could program something that a robot could create something that we might interpret as creative. And I think that's what it really comes down to, is when I see an emotion, when I see somebody walk, when I see somebody have an emotive expression, the only way I know and understand that emotion is because if I express myself that way, or if I sit like that, I know what that feels like. And so the only way for me to understand an expression, whether it's an impressionistic expression with lots of blur and colors and shooting stars, or whether it's some abstract square, or whether it's a portrait of a person with a particular emotional expression, I can only understand that because I have had those experiences.
Yes, but in the case of Aya, for example, can she experience this? Can she experience this kind of emotion? Because you can recognize the emotion because you can experience it. But for a robot to recognize emotion, how can you see this? I mean, how can you? What is the difference?
Yeah, we can make a robot understand our emotions, just like we understand another person's emotion. A robot can understand our emotions by looking at our behavior, our facial
You can
expressions,
learn it.
and she can learn it, or she can be pre-programmed to have it.
Mm-hmm.
Then she can take one of these emotions and see what happens if she expresses herself that way.
Mm-hmm.
The question is really, does she actually have emotion?
Yes.
An interesting question for art is, if I see two art pieces and I have no idea where they came from,
Mm-hmm.
and I judge them in terms of artistic versus not artistic, what do I go by?
Mm-hmm.
Beauty, technique, style I recognize, the emotion it elicits, could be any of those.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it is really the latter that we're looking for.
Yes.
And then it's also a way to get into maybe the soul of the robot, to understand what this robot is really trying to express.
So is emotion, how do you say, is emotion vital for art?
Well, based on the definition that you gave, emotion or art is the most individualistic expression of individualistic emotion.
Yes.
By that definition, an entity that creates art that doesn't have emotion doesn't make art.
Mm-hmm.
But then, as we discussed, Warhol, Marcel Duchamp, people like that, do they fall outside the definition of art? And I think it's the line of art, especially with this emotion, that is interesting to pull through to robots, robots as humans. And for the longest time, we have thought that creativity and art is maybe what distinguishes us from robots and animals.
Yes.
Because you can argue that animals have emotions, but the question is really, do these robots have emotions? And if they have emotions, if they create art, do they elevate to a higher human level? I don't know.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting, eh? To think about, because what would happen if a robot could integrate the idea of mortality or immortality?
Do you think mortality is important in art?
No, immortality or mortality. I think it is very important for human being to be driven by the idea of mortality. Absolutely. Right. I think it's a very interesting subject in art.
Yeah, so for a robot, most of these robots like Ida, she can be repaired. She can be fueled with energy. Her mind can be updated. We should get back to that about mind updates, actually. Her mind can be updated. And the interesting part would be, and as an engineer, and then we'll get back to the robots real quick here, because I feel like we're going on a little bit of a tangent. But if we make a robot mortal, say a robot learns just like a person, lives in an environment for a while, learns about it, and then recognizes as it ages that the mechanisms aren't working quite as well. Something's camera might get blurry a little bit, or one of the cameras doesn't work anymore. Then if this robot, if indeed emotions and mortality are emergent properties of a complex system full of wires and neurons, would they start expressing themselves in a manner that's consistent? Just like there's what's it called? I forgot the name. There's an art form that's related to the change in artistic expressions that people show when they age, from very realistic representations. They stand in the world, they see everything realistic, to enriching themselves with experiences and other people and knowledge, and their expression becomes more and more artistic, not artistic, more and more abstract as they age. You see that in quite a few artists. Shall we jump? Shall we talk about some of the robots that you photographed?
Yes.
This is Bina 48.
Yes, Bina 48. She's also a very interesting robot. She's made as a kind of a Geminoid. That means she's a kind of copy of the real Bina Rothblatt. And she had, with the real Bina, 400 hours of conversations to really create a kind of a mind file. And that has to do with also with mortality, because she was actually designed to, when the real Bina dies, then all the memories, because of these conversations, these 100 hours of conversations, that the Bina as a robot can still be there with the mind file of the real Bina, but in the same time she's self-learning, so she creates her own experiences, and so she gets also her own identity. So there is this mix of this mind file of the real Bina and her own search for her own kind of individual persona. So that's a very, very fascinating robot, I think, because it has also to do with to survive, the biological human being into a robot. So that's actually the story of Bina 48.
Yeah, so it's a little bit like she became immortal. They
Yes.
created her talking, they created the robot talking to herself for hundreds and hundreds of hours,
Yes.
and then living on without being reprogrammed, without being fed other information. All the information she gets now, and she continues to live, is through conversations with other people and
Yes.
through her own eyes. So she creates a world, and at some point the expressions in her eyes might change, just like, a person gaining more knowledge might ultimately start expressing themselves. So it would actually be very interesting to follow these robots through time and maybe even capture them. And really what we wanted to do with the project is to follow the evolution of robotics,
Yes.
Which continues, and we may continue, but to see a change in a robot because they have been in the world and expressed themselves and educated themselves also about what it's like to be a robot. You look at some of these robots like Sophia in China, another David Hansen robot, or Einstein teaching kids in China, the one we photographed. They are very aware of who they are. Part of that is pre-programmed, but part of that is also just like ChatGPT. ChatGPT may know nothing about robots or AI. You can feed it a lot of information, a lot of articles, a lot of movies, a lot of YouTube videos about that, and be able to talk about what it's like to be a robot.
Yes, but also this idea of Geminoid, say this selfie, in a way, the modern selfie, or the reproduction of the real person in a robot, is also a subject in robotics that really is an item. It's really interesting how this works. For example, of course, the best example is Ishiguro, the Professor Ishiguro, who always, who makes Geminoids, but also, when the Geminoid, when he's older and the Geminoid still stays young, first he does plastic surgery and whatever to resemble the android, but when the other way around, when the android is not looking, is not the same resemblance anymore.
Android doesn't age.
Yes, then he makes a new Geminoid who looks better. So it is really for him a kind of a way of looking at himself through a robot. It is very interesting.
Yeah, it's almost like, I think the first, so this is Ishiguro. And we're not going to say who is the real person and who is the Geminoid. So this is the second one he made after the first one. The first one he used to give presentations at different conferences in his stead, right? So rather than him going to a conference, he used the robot to represent him. And it might also be very interesting to look at a robot. It's not like a mirror. If you look in the mirror, it mimics all your same actions. If you look at a Geminoid of yourself, who's capable of acting, who might have started with a mind file like Bina 48 of yours, and then still evolves. It's almost like twins.
Yes.
So it's almost like an artistic creation. It's almost like dynamic art. You create something, you put it in the earth, and you see how it evolves, and you see what it ultimately can create. Because if they become truly emotive and empathetic, what type of emotions are they creating? So some other Geminoids that he created. This one is a real person in his lab. Do you remember any further details about her?
No, that she's from a real woman that he knows, and so he copied the appearance of her into this Geminoid, and she was also playing in a movie, I guess. Yeah. So there is another one, Geminoid. We don't have it here on our. No. There is another one who is also Geminoid F2, the other one. She's actually a little bit the same as this one, but they are real women, they are copies of real women that's why I want to say also it has a kind of a way, it's a kind of a modern sculpture, it's really built after a real person in a how do you say, in a form, in a sculpture,
Yeah, in a human form that is capable of moving. We already touched on Suzeki as an android. There's also a very famous person, Philip K. Dick, a sci-fi writer, and you can see here, so from the front, he very much looks like a person. From the side, you can see that this is already a little bit later than some of the other robots. The machinery has even miniaturized further, and ultimately you might even be able to put it in a neck and have some other equipment, more cameras or sound in the top, or microphone arrays in the top. But this person, Philip K. Dick, the scientific sci-fi writer, he is reading his own works. So a lot of the robots that are depicted are themselves creative individuals. So we have an interesting mix here where we can look at the robot as a piece of art, as a sculpture.
Yeah.
We can look at the robot as the recreation of an artist in their own time, Suzeki, Philip K. Dick, who then reproduce and read their own art. We can also look at the creation of a robot as something capable of creating music or dancing, or as we discussed, Ida, art. Ida. This one, she has her easel with her. But we see also that some artists commission robot designers to create themselves. And we have two examples. Can you say something about?
Yeah, this is Leonard van Münster. He's an artist in the Netherlands, and he made also a copy of himself as a robot. The dancing white man is actually a man who dances, but he's a little bit stiff. And he, when he dances, he's a little bit, he's a little bit stiff. So it's a very funny kind of way of, making a robot not only as a kind of a replica of oneself, but also questioning the movements, you know, the movements of himself actually as dancing into a robot. So this kind of dynamic and identity, dynamics and identity comes beautifully into this robot. And that's actually also, he's also an artist. So, and the other example of a Dutch artist is the beautiful robot Annelies. Annelies is the LA Raven. They are two sisters. They are twins, and they wanted to create a third sister, Annelies. And Annelies is actually, you know, the kind of, so you have the twins and hoe noem je een drieling? No. So actually they created a new sister for themselves, and with and Annelies is the yes, the one who is actually the robot that they created.
I never realized that, but with the dancing white man, when you create a self-portrait, you just create an image of yourself.
Yes.
You might be able to capture a particular
Yes.
emotion or mood.
Yeah.
That's it. When you create a robot, you can do that.
Yes.
But you can also add other personalities, maybe insecurities, maybe inabilities within that dynamic sculpture.
Yeah. And in this one, it's very interesting because it's not a beautiful robot, you know, and that's what they wanted also. They wanted to, because they found that most of those robots are very beautiful. And they wanted actually not having this beautiful robot, but more indeed what you said, these emotions, you know, these kind of the human emotions, like being very tristig, sad, you know, and desperate, you know, this kind of more dark emotions, you know, that you mostly don't see in with robots.
Do you know if this sister is a combination of the personalities or looks of both human sisters, or
both human sisters are really identical. You don't see the difference between them. So she's actually actually it could be the third one, you know. They are really identical. It's not yeah.
We talked about mortality, and we should have popped up this picture. I think it has a lot of things to do with everything that we discussed. It shows the motors are much bigger. This is an older robot. It's just a head. It's not a full robot yet. So this was really a robot, again, in Japan at the Meiji University, called Kansai 2, where they tried to experiment with facial expressions.
It was the first one, who was experienced with facial expressions.
I think so.
Yeah.
Yes, and at that point, they did not have the facial rubber, the frubber that David Hansen was able to produce to create, you know, a very good face, for example. You can't really tell, you know, that this is not human face. It's almost too perfect. It's a little bit doll-like. But if you look at a robot like Einstein, you see some of the irregularities of the face, and it begins to look a whole lot more realistic. And if you look at this with a high resolution camera, as Wanda was explaining in the beginning, you know, you see all the little details, and it becomes more and more unrealistic. And one of the things that I would like to bring out is that with these robots, when we look at these robots, there is a term called uncanny valley, which is really the transition from humanoids, where you have robots in the form of a human body, to androids and geminoids. This is an android or a geminoid of a person in the past. These robots, when you look at them and glance at them, okay, it's a human. You might walk past it on the street and you might think it's a human. But then when you start interacting with it, especially the ones from a few years ago, they might go into a silent stare of have a little twitch, or their eyes are completely frozen. And that becomes very eerie. We only know that to happen when a person dies. So these types of robots, they switch kind of between being dead and alive. And that is very unnerving for people. In some ways, it's better to have a robot that doesn't trigger that. So if you look at the types of robots that have been extensively used in classrooms, it's often robots that have a human form, that can talk, that may have arms and legs, but they aren't looking like humans. Eventually, and if you look at some of the robots these days, you might get into a situation where you can have a very long conversation with a robot like that without ever feeling that it's a robot. Mm. So back to Kansai, this is a facial material that was also attached to little wires on motors that could pull the facial expressions, could create the different facial expressions. But here we see that time takes a toll on this face, almost like a real person face. If the gravity kind of pulls it down, so there is a natural aging of this robot throughout the years, and the expressions change. So when I was talking, or when we were talking about mortality of a robot, and if a robot could actually feel this and recognize this, and the internal state of the robot becomes aware of the fact that I might ultimately not be able to do anything and I might die, what does that do to the creative expressions of the robot? And even just the emotional expressions of the robot. If we think of a robot as a living sculpture, it becomes the sculpture over time, transitioning through degradation, through the toil that life takes on a robot.
Yeah.
So there are many more interesting stories we can tell. There is a Asimov. Everybody knows Isaac Asimov, the father of the laws of robotics, where a robot needs to. Okay. I'm blanking out, but anyway, the three laws of robotics, where is that the robot shouldn't harm people, should serve people, it shouldn't harm people, and it also shouldn't harm itself unless that would cause it to harm humans or not be useful for humans. But Asimov also wrote a very nice story, and it's really him recognizing that those laws of robotics, where robots are really servants to humans, to protect humans, to protect themselves, start failing. Because once the robot becomes intelligent enough, the robot recognizes, and this is in the story called Reason, the robots recognize that humans are fallible and that the best way to save them is to put them in a cabinet and not let them touch anything in the spaceship. So this is a doomsday scenario that plays a role in many people. But here we really want to focus on the aspects of what is it like to be human, and is artistic expression something that is truly human, or something that robots can also create, or is IDA just a novelty, curiosity that we recognize as art that ultimately vanishes, and robots are no longer part of the creative expression and may not be the next step in the evolution of creative expression. So I would like to open it up to questions.
Well, I have a comment or a question. As they become more practical robots, as we have find ourselves in the years ahead having many more robots integrated into society, whether as robot armies, robot workers, robot home health aides, etc.
Right.
How will that affect And of course, where I'm coming from is art making. So,
Right.
um, will we conceivably have robot artists who are making art for robot collectors?
That's one possibility. You can also flip it around, right? One of the models of robotics is that we are all after trying to satisfy our basic needs. Our food needs, our shelter needs, our safety needs is Maslow's law. At the top is self-actualization. His idea is that ultimately we want to all self-actualize. We want to create, we want to be creative, we want to make something new, we want to be able to express ourselves the way we want to express ourselves. And one thing that robots might make possible, if they take away all the menial tasks, all the dangerous tasks, all the difficult tasks, that humans are left in a environment where they can creatively express themselves without having to worry about sustaining themselves with food or shelter or things like that. So we can look at it as a doomsday where robots are taking over everything and they're becoming the new humans, and we're becoming inferior. But we can also think of it as robots enable us to become more human and more creative. And perhaps we are, together with robots, evolving to create new art. Maybe robots create their own art. We might even think that animals create art the way they scratch a tree or leave patterns on the ground. It can go any direction. It doesn't have to be fearful, but I'm fascinated by the fact that as a roboticist working with an artist, do these robots really continue to create art, or is it then just a machine that produces something that we call art, but is it really truly art? Is art something human?
Well, I think one of the common threads in society at the moment, and also reflected in the art world, is we now have AI capable and normally every day creating more and more imagery
Right.
or modifying it. You could say that it's algorithmically adjusting images into something new.
Absolutely.
Uh, Before that, we had the digital revolution that took over from the analog sphere of creativity, of photography, video, et cetera, et cetera. That revolutionized that. Um, Going forward, I could see where a combination of AI was, and also AI is already threatening jobs on a massive scale. So we could see where a lot of white collar workers, a lot of people who are in professions where what their output is, whether it's lawyers with documents or and contracts and so forth, or
Sure.
others that are producing other kinds of outputs, um, could be very readily replaced by either robots or simply AI itself without a physical manifestation of a robot.
Yeah.
Um, the missing link in all of this, and I should say also concomitantly, in the time I've been around the art world, which is quite a long time, uh, I've seen it go from a very tiny number of artists, very tiny number of collectors, very tiny number of exhibition spaces, to the massive scale that we know now on the global level.
Yes.
Uh, and yet, for the most part, no one's making money making art. I mean, that's a generalization, but it's pretty apt that it's still something that people do if they can, and the hope of really monetizing it is fairly limited, at least looking at the numbers of artists that exist, which is in a huge scale. Most estimates are multiple millions worldwide. Um, so I guess where I'm going is with robotics combined with AI, it seems like a very strange landscape that not so much we will see, but the next generation or so will start seeing. And I'm not sure how they're going to relate that, what their conception of art is going to be, and how the art world might possibly function in a world that is that um, dominated by non-humans.
Yeah.
Right.
So I'd say it's more of an ethical issue than an aesthetic issue.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, I mean, the whole creation of robots, of course, is ethical. What did they do? What did they take over? In the current economic model, they are taking away jobs. New jobs will be created, just like every industrial revolution has created as many new jobs, more in fact, because the population grows.
Mhm.
But the question is really, is it still considered art? Do they become artists? And does it even make sense for robots to create arts? How does it help human beings? I mean, it's art is an expression that also helps us see the world differently, to look at the world differently, to think about words differently, scenery differently, objects differently. Art has played a huge role in changing our perspectives all the time, very much like scientists have done. So if robots embedded or imbued with AI can facilitate that, where they can give us new perspectives of the world, and perhaps more importantly, new perspectives of themselves, and more insight into what makes these robots robots and how do they think about the world. It might actually bring humans and robots closer together and reduce the fear, just like maybe religious art is a similar example.
We'll have to see. I don't know.
Right. Yeah.
Call,
Interesting
call
time.
me
That's
call
for
me a
sure.
skeptic. I guess I've seen a lot of changes in the art world and in technology as it's been absorbed by the art world. In the past of Artist Talk and Art, we did panels on things like the combination of the camera and the artist. That is, that using cameras as a tool, not for the purpose of image making per se, but using them as a tool in which to assist with the creation of plastic art. As just one example.
Yeah.
And
No,
that
you
we
could you
had,
could
there were movements in the art world, like technology related movements in the art world. I think it was in 1968 or somewhere like that. Rauschenberg and Billy Kluver and several other artists and technologists uh, started exploring ways in which art could interact with technology and so on, and vice versa. So periodically that happens.
yeah.
Uh, what's the name of the objects, where they would create something and make a one of a kind object and that people were investing in that? Do you recall that?
Oh, and NF, what are these things called? It's
Yeah,
basically has a
NFTs,
NFTs,
NFTs.
NFT. Yeah.
NFTs, right?
Well, that's no longer with
Yeah.
us. That sort of crashed
Yeah.
and burned as an idea.
Yeah. I mean, when art becomes more dynamic, maybe robots can also become very useful as a tool, as a partner, as a collaborator in creating art. I have worked with people from University of British Columbia, where we had haptic devices between a
Mhm.
machine and a human, and the way the haptic device or the device bent created different music. And he went with this all around the world to
Mhm.
show this human machine interaction creating a new form, because the human couldn't anticipate what the machine was doing because it had its own entity. And it created a whole different experience of two entities collaborating in a way that is completely novel. So that could also happen with robots. Uh, we could have experiments where a robot is completely raised in a particular environment,
Mhm.
comes out of the environment, and then that becomes a creative, interesting, artistic expression, perhaps, of how does this robot interact with that world. And we can see through the behavior and the actions of the robot what that robot might be experiencing. Just like some of the scientific experiments that have been done when you raise a cat in a vertically striped world and then you put them in a real world and they immediately fall over. because their whole visual system was trained. So it's, it's perhaps not artistic, but there's all kinds of creative, interesting things one could do collaborating and working with the robots. And my work is all about coordination and collaboration between a machine and a human, never automation, never separate.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Do we have any other comments or questions?
I see two hands up.
Go ahead, whoever you are, unmute yourself.
Hello?
Yeah.
Is this working?
Hello.
Yep, we hear you.
All right. Do I go first or the other person?
It's okay.
Someone needs to go.
Is there a determining factor in eventually deciding when androids become conscious, or will we never really know if they are, even if they can say they are?
Yeah, if they say they're conscious, I personally don't buy that. The interesting part is when we look at another human, we recognize ourselves in that human, in the way it moves, the way it expresses, what causes it to have certain emotions and insecurities, and through the people that we know, when we observe something that acts like us and emotes like us in situations that we recognize where we might do the same, we very much feel that this entity is related and similar to us. And we may never know whether it is a true internal state that the robot has. We can pre-program that, and neural nets have layers and layers of internal states that we don't really have any access to. But the importance is that, if these robots lived on their own planet or in their own environment, they would create languages, and experiments have been done with that. But if they really work with humans and around humans, at some point it's going to be impossible for us to distinguish whether this is a human or a robot. We can't even tell, we can't even measure consciousness in us, brain activity. It's really just brain activity in certain areas, connections that are happening, complexity of the wiring that's happening. That's nothing different than a robot. So if you go by the fact that consciousness and emotions are emergent property of a complex, heavily wired system, then it's quite possible that robots will also have an internal world. And perhaps the only way for them to make that clear to us is through natural language, but we may not trust that as much as actually seeing them emoting in a way that's identical to humans. It is like the Turing test that I talked about, but then on a full human body movement, emoting, interacting scale. Did that answer your question?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Sorry. I just didn't know if I should continue to speak
it's okay.
back or
if you don't agree, I'm all ears.
No, I do completely.
Olga?
Hi. I'm an artist and scholar, and I would like to ask the question: what is artists themselves, yourself? Okay, what do you think about imagination and psychology of people who cannot produce anything different but just trying to replicate humans? What about their imagination? Why they cannot think even about producing something different? What about their psychology? How they can confront this? What kind of mental I don't know, mental situation there. What is these people are lonely, cannot find connection to humans? What their psychology actually is?
Yeah, no, in just a question. We'll never be able to get at their psychology, unless we talk talk to them as through a therapist or a psychologist or a psychiatrist. I think the topic of imagination is perhaps more interesting. I mean, most of you, I assume, have read and interacted with ChatGPT and probably been amazed about some of the connections it makes and some of the inferences it produces. The question is, if we knew everything already, would we feel as imaginative as we are? Sometimes we have an insight and then later we realize that 20 other people already had the same idea. So we feel we are very creative, but maybe it is also partially due to the fact that we don't know as much as a ChatGPT. We haven't seen all the YouTubes, we haven't seen all the movies, we haven't read all the books. We're not, tied to Facebook and all those social media and having immediate rapid access to it. And Wanda has often called it a collective consciousness, and now unconsciousness, or even a collective consciousness. Or subconsciousness. The question is what comes out of that? So again, imagination, what is it really? When we recognize it, we call somebody imaginative because they can come up with new ideas. But arguably an AI, and if you put it in a robot, you've got an AI robot, can also become incredibly imaginative. And it is really just letting go of your cognitive filters, don't fall in the mainstream, let everything inspire you, connect it in ways that seem natural or unnatural to you, and just take it forward. So that creative ability, I don't see why robots can't do that.
Yeah, but if you see, for example, the example of Ida, who makes self-portraits of herself, it's also a way, an expression of imagination. I mean, it is also, the way she uses color, the way she has a kind of a signature, you can recognize.
Listen, my question is not about robots. My question about people who produce them. Why they try to create something that's similar to people? Why they cannot imagine something absolutely different? I'm talking about imagination, psychology of these people who working on that, not about robots.
Okay, I understand. I'm sorry, I misunderstood that.
That's okay. That's okay.
Yeah, so as a mathematician, as a scientist, we always try to create a mathematical understanding of a process. Gravity is an example. We measure, we create equations, and now we have a formula that links the size of the mass of two objects that come together. It's the same thing in humans. For us to really understand how a human functions and how humans relate, the best way to do that is to try to create a human. From a scientist point of view, if you can create something that cannot be distinguished from a human, you have learned a lot about what it is like to be a human. If we can create a dog or a mouse, and that research also happens, that interacts with real mice, and the real mice can't detect it, except for maybe smell, we have learned a lot about the ecology and the behavioral patterns of a mouse. So we create these embodied creatures to understand their movement, their limitations, their psychology, their sociology. If we want to understand sociology, we can take 50 robots and see if they have different personalities and if they create little groups. And if there are certain fights, and if some people can't communicate with each other, you can play with that with AI. And I'm also doing that in meetings between people. We create avatars that then specifically try to understand and provoke and present themselves as a certain psychological entity to see what happens to the other humans. So using a human in that context helps us understand what it is like to be humans. And this is the first time in history that we were able to do that. We've thought about it, since antiquity, and philosophy, of course, is all about that.
The late painter Will Barnett, who appeared with us about 6 times, on one of his appearances said, up until World War II, every artist was outer directed. They were looking at landscape, they were looking at people, they were looking at still lives. And then they would be interpreting that and painting things that were primarily representational. Even, you could argue, even surrealism had its roots in representation. It was mainly representative. But then after World War II, as a result of the Holocaust and the war itself, they turned inward. And then came, the dominance of abstraction, conceptual art, minimalism, and a number of other things that emerged after World War II. And arguably, many of those movements still exist. There's still, there's no way to explain Gerhard Richter without saying that abstract expressionism is still very much alive. It's how I paint. But, that's 80 some years later.
Sure.
So it's arguable that movements, even among humans anyway, movements tend to have great sticking power. There are still people making what we could call pop art. There are still people making many formats or genre that existed in the 50s, 60s, or 70s. So it's possible that as AI is so duplicative, it looks at what people are doing, learns it, and then spits it out. So it's possible that robots will go through their own 80 or 100 years of creating some of the very art that exists today, at least stylistically.
Sure.
Very possible. Yeah. Yeah. Or they may create something very different. And, just in terms of the longevity of some mediums of expression, the English language continues to be extremely useful in terms of expressing ourselves in all kinds of ways, also artistic ways.
Right.
And some of the ways, or some of the tools and techniques of painting or collages or photographing will persist until we have completely exhausted it, or until it really becomes a useful medium to communicate through.
Yeah. Possible. Probable.
I just recently, some artists and me, we talked about this situation, and some saying that what is going on right now actually disrupt human connection, and what they're doing, it's of course it was jokingly, but still, what they're doing, they're trying to produce more and more patients for the psychotherapy.
You mean the AI robots are the patients?
Yes, yeah. So
current social media is producing that?
In social media and robots and everything, technology just right now, it's, of course, it's a joke, but technology right now trying to produce more and more patients for psychotherapy.
Yeah. No,
That's only what is going on.
I think that's not completely untrue. I think there's a lot of truth in it. And you see that with technology always, right? Technology advances extremely rapidly. And then ethics catches up, society catches up, and then it becomes normal and ubiquitous. When the computer was first developed, we only need 8 computers in the world. That's enough. Everybody can use that. Make them big enough and everybody can tap into it. Nobody envisioned everybody having a cell phone. It's very well possible that we'll all have a robot buddy who carries our stuff, who remembers our stuff, who propels our bike for us, you name it. Could be very useful. Right now it's frightening because we don't know in the current society and economic models that we have, how these robots are going to impact our lives. And we see a degradation in social skills and abilities and even intellect and confidence in today's youth. And to a large degree, that's social media. I think, robots just now are really becoming more ubiquitous in society because AI and robotics has been fused in the last few years, where these robots are really able to learn themselves. And now we have robots that run marathons. And we have robots that can dance. We have robots that can, really help nurses in hospitals. We have robots who participate with baggage handlers at airplanes, at airports, et cetera, et cetera.
Yes, but also you don't really address the energy problem and how we can get all these resources for producing these robots. Human bodies are completely recyclable, but robots, it's very difficult question. So there are a lot of problems. You're talking about something that positive, and don't try to talk about even a little bit about negatives.
Well, yes, of course, there are negative things, and energy is one of them, but they're all solvable. If you look at the state of the planet, humans are not a good thing to the planet, right? You're talking about plastics. Human bodies are recyclable, but the amount of plastic and unrecyclable material that we create through our lifetime is multiple times higher than a robot, because a robot doesn't eat.
Technology. Plastic is technology. It's not human body. It's technology produced plastic, produced robot, produced more, and more. So what's going to happen with all this development of technology?
It can seem dangerous and scary, but it may also be very good. We can employ robots to clean up the mess that people make, right? Wouldn't it be wonderful to be in a city that's not filthy? I spent a month in Delhi. It's unbelievable, the amount of trash that is everywhere. If you go to a city like Paris, it's cleaned every day. It's a pleasant experience to be there. If you go to Amsterdam, you've got it every week. If you go to New York City, so there's lots of negativity and improvements that can be created in society by robots, by introducing robots that are able to navigate through a city just like we do. And of course, it's a utopia. And robots are also used for, drone warfare and things like that, and taking jobs away. But I'm personally not so afraid about taking jobs away, because the Industrial Revolution, the unemployment after the Industrial Revolution wasn't higher. The introduction of computers, the unemployment after the introduction of computers wasn't higher, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think robots are going to do that either. There will be new jobs. The only thing that might be required is an increase in education of the population, because there is definitely a dumbing of the population going on that somehow has to be reversed. And maybe robot buddies, you already see that kids talking with ChatGPT, whether they develop new ideas or not is a question, but are becoming more informed because their parents are not really talking to them. Most parents talk to their kids for 15 minutes, and it's mostly, did you do your homework? Did you eat your food? And did you clean up your room? Maybe art is the solution.
Doubtful. Let's see if there's one more comment or question, and then I think we will call it an afternoon and an evening. Does anybody else have a comment or a question? Okay, I would like to thank Erwin Boer and Wanda Tuerlinckx for an unusual discussion about robots and AI and art. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this interesting conversation.
Yeah, it's a wonderful opportunity. It's not often we get to talk about robots and art together on a forum like this. So thank you for inviting us.
We're very happy you came.
Very stimulating.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Doug.
Thank you.